Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Melissa Mann. I am the site administrator at Drakewell Museum and Park. And I'm very pleased that you're able to join us tonight for our first ever live online lecture. There may be a few snags. I'm hoping not. Jessica and I have kind of worked on logistics, so we're hoping things will go smooth here. But I hope that all of you are doing well, staying healthy, staying mentally fit in these strange times that we find ourselves in. As you can imagine, the museum is undergoing some transitions at the moment. Our staff is working from home, and our site is closed, and we have a few essential staff members who are on site daily to make sure that our sites and our collections are protected, and to do the essential work that we need to do daily on site. But otherwise, we continue to, our staff continues to fulfill our educational mission from home. And part of that is making sure that we engage and educate our audience, you all. And so we have taken an event that is normally an event that we hold in March. Wisdom and Wine is our lecture series that we hold in March on site. And we have transitioned it online with the gracious help of a couple of our speakers who were scheduled to present to us in March. And Jessica is one of those folks. We are so very pleased that she was willing to work with us on this. Couple of logistics. If you haven't used Zoom before, everybody's microphone is muted, and we're going to continue, keep it that way, because sometimes if microphones get unmuted, then we get feedback that interrupts the presentation. However, we are going to take questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is right in the middle a chat box, and it's got little chat bubble icon. If you click on that, it will open up a menu on the side of your screen, and you are able to write anything that you would like, questions, and we're going to hold the questions until the end. But Jessica is willing to answer questions, so please feel free to put that in there. If you wouldn't mind, I'm trying to keep track of how many folks are joining us this evening, and I know we might have a few folks who are watching on the same computer. So if you are not a single on the computer, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat box how many folks are watching from where you are, that would be very helpful and appreciated. Otherwise, I think, oh, there's also, if you look to the very right of your screen at the bottom, there is a button called reactions. Since our mics are muted, we're not going to be able to hear applause, which I am positive we are going to have at the end of this. If you have any positive reactions, please feel free to give Jessica a thumbs up or some clapping. We would all appreciate that. So I think that is all I have for logistics, and we'll go ahead and get started here. Like I said, we are so very pleased to have Jessica Hilburn with us this evening. Jessica is the executive director of Benson Memorial Library here in Titusville. She is also the author of Hidden History of Northwestern Pennsylvania, which was published in 2019. Jessica is a native of Titusville. She has a bachelor's in history and political science from Mercyhurst University and a master's degree from Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. And what seems like many moons ago now, she was an intern at Drakewell Museum when I started as the site administrator. Jessica is going to speak to us tonight on the hidden history of oil era Titusville, looking at how the Drakewell oil strike affected the other realms of life in the mid to late 1800s. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Jessica. Oh, can't hear you.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Melissa. Let me get my presentation up for you here. What can you see? Okay. So like Melissa said, my name is Jessica Hilburn, and I wrote a book called The Hidden History of Northwestern Pennsylvania. You can see the cover here. So if you ever see that around, that's my book. And she gave you a rundown on me, but I used to be the historian and head of reference and adult services at the library. I'm now the executive director, although I still do my history stuff on the side, so we haven't lost that completely. I am from Titusville. I went to Mercyhurst and to Edinburgh. I'm in school again, getting my library science degree, my master's in library science. And as you can see here, I love cats. So that's just a little bit about me as a person. But as for some history in Northwestern Pennsylvania, focusing on Titusville. So as we know, Edwin Drake founded the first commercial oil well in 1859, but something that we don't talk about quite as much is how that impacted people's lives, their day-to-day lives, instead of just the commercial industry. What was it like to live in the oil region from 1859 to the 1880s? And the first thing I want to talk about is rail disasters. So a good portion of my book has things about disasters and murder and kind of like darker stuff in it, but it gives you a good idea of actually what it was like to live here, because there were so many different ways that you could die just because it was a dangerous place to be. So for rail disasters, up until this point in time, the largest rail disaster was in Ashtabula, Ohio. This happened in 1876. And on December 29th, a train from Erie was going into Ohio, and it was really, really snowy, as you can see in these this postcard and this picture from Harper's Weekly on top. And because it had snowed so much, this bridge in Ashtabula, Ohio was just covered in ice and covered in thick snow. And the train was going at a pretty normal pace, but when it hit this bridge, it turned out that the bridge was not constructed to hold the weight of the train plus the weight of the snow. And it ended up collapsing, as you can see here. And that accident killed 92 of the 159 people who were aboard the train at that time. So that was an incredibly deadly train disaster that was pretty near to this region. However, before that happened, we had the Titusville slaughter of 1865. So this wasn't as spectacular as an accident, but it was very impactful. So on August 24th, 1865, we had the Oil Creek Railroad. Now this isn't your current OC&T type railroad. This was a different railroad that came in from Corey, went to Titusville and out. And when the Oil Creek Railroad, there was a train coming into Titusville from Corey to Titusville. And when it was rounding its curve, sort of where Spring Street is now coming into that last bend into Titusville, all of a sudden there was another train coming head on. And it was too late to be able to do much, so the trains ended up colliding. The operators put on the brakes and they jumped off the train, but everybody else who was a passenger really had no idea what was coming for them. 6 people died instantly, but there were a lot of people around at the time, and after the crash occurred, they were trying to pull victims from the train cars because they could see them in there suffering, so they were trying to pull them out. There were many people with pretty horrendous injuries, severed limbs and amputations. There were just kind of limbs strewn around the accident site. And at the time, the Titusville Herald really liked to expound on people's injuries. So they were very graphic about what the scene looked like. So if you ever want to read the original transcript, I can show you where it is, because it's very different than what you'd read in the paper today. So they were trying to figure out what was happening, why did this happen? So at the time, the Oil Creek Railroad was selling more tickets than they had seats on the train. And this was simply because the train was the fastest way to get from place to place at the time. So many people needed to travel that they would just let you come in and have standing room only. And they would not only have you stand in the train cars, but they'd also have you stand on the open platforms. And as you can imagine, in a train wreck, standing exposed on an open platform probably wasn't going to go very well for you. After the accident happened, people wanted to publicly hang the railroad executives. And in the paper, they called them miserable carcasses of human beings. They said that the Oil Creek Railroad was a monopoly and that they only cared about money over people's lives, which wasn't entirely inaccurate. And it was a real monopoly in the region just because there, other than on foot, horse and buggy, there really weren't any other ways to quickly travel. So they did have a hold on people being able to get from place to place. So they impaneled a coroner's jury to decide who was at fault for this accident. And the jury determined that the freight train operators were at fault. So the passenger train was the one coming, I'll use this hand backwards, coming into Titusville from Corey, and the freight train was the one leaving Titusville. So when they hit, they determined that the freight train was at fault. And this was because they failed to wait. So the freight train operators actually knew that there was another train coming from Corey, but they thought that they could go fast enough and beat the train to the switch, and that they could get past before the passenger train came upon them. And that clearly was not the case. The other thing they did was they failed to put out a flagger to tell them if the train was coming. They just pretty much threw all caution to the wind and said, we can make it. They didn't make it. After the wreck occurred and they pulled the brakes and they jumped off the train, they fled the scene. They were the only people who didn't really try to help. They didn't try to help the victims. They didn't try to pull people out. They didn't want to take responsibility. They just left. And a couple days later, people were still dealing with the injuries that they sustained during this accident. And one of those people was named Steele Green. He was a Civil War veteran who was from Highttown, and he was on the train at the time. And when he got on the train, he asked for a seat and was denied one. He said that, he's a Civil War veteran, he had had injuries. Can I please have somewhere to sit down? And they said, no, you have to stand. So he was put in the open platform. And because of that, when the trains collided, his leg was completely amputated, completely severed. And at the time he survived, but a couple days later he died. And because of his death, that's when things kind of really started to get real for the train operators, because they impaneled an actual coroner's jury that was to pin blame for an indictment on somebody. And what they ended up doing was they decided to charge Mr. Struthers, who might sound familiar because of Struthers Wells, of Warren, because he was the owner of the Oil Creek Railroad, in Green's death, as well as the freight train operators. The court called their actions evil, not only in jumping off the train and not helping anybody, but also in forcing people to stand and caring more about money than they did their passengers. However, they ended up refusing to indict Struthers, so he was only charged and not indicted. And officially, no one was ever tried or held responsible for any of the deaths that occurred during or after this accident. So this is just one example of many different rail disasters that happened during this time period, both in Titusville and in the greater oil region, just because of how dangerous trains were, how they weren't constructed quite to standards of keeping people safe, and more to standards of how much money we can make, which is the real story of transportation in general during this time and technology. So somebody else I want to talk about is Stonehouse Jack. And if you have been in downtown Titusville in the past few years, you should recognize the name Stonehouse Jack, just because we now have a store that is called Stonehouse Jack, owned by Ross Rio. And it is named after this man. So if you don't know why it's called that, you're about to be able to school everybody if they ever ask you. So Stonehouse Jack, The first store in Titusville was opened in 1816. So this was before Titusville was a city. This is just like frontier sort of stuff. It's where Lavery's is today, and that block has a long history of fire, which you will come to realize. So Stonehouse Jack's real name was Robert Vance, and on January 22nd, 1866, around 9:30 p.m., a peal rang out, and there was a house on fire on Main Street. So the fire department sent their truck to go, sent their horse and carriage, you know what I mean, to go. But at the time they were doing a bucket brigade. So people were literally lining up with buckets full of water and trying to put out this relatively small house fire. But what they didn't realize was this was just a distraction, because right after people started to tend to the house fire, the Chase block went up in flames, which is that block I was talking about. And when they tried to send the horse-drawn cart fire engine, they found out that the fire hose they had been sabotaged and it was cut, so they wouldn't be able to use it to put the fire out. And because of that, the entire building was pretty much destroyed. So people were very upset about this. There were multiple fires going on. Fire wasn't an unusual thing at the time, but a fire of this size was very noticeable, of course. The next morning, Robert Vance was named as the culprit. He was also called Stonehouse Jack, Buffalo Jack, and he was known as a boxer and a brothel owner from Petroleum Center, and he would sort of rove around with a few of his friends and kind of cause trouble. At the time, people tried to take them, so they were arrested and they were put in jail, and after they were put in jail, roving groups of angry citizens tried to pull them out of the jailhouse so that they could inflict their own punishment, because in their opinion, the justice system, as you could call it at this time, was not acting fast enough. They wrote in the paper that all of the, quote, vagrants, harlots, and pimps needed to be lynched, just a couple of them, not all of them, just one or two. You could just lynch a couple of vagrants, harlots, or pimps, and then everything would be okay. So they were advocating that we would just grab a couple and it would be over, and the fires would stop, because like I said, fires weren't unusual at this time. Thankfully, that did not quite go that way. They described Stonehouse Jack, which is the premise for the portrait that was created for the store Stonehouse Jack, which is where the picture's from. They described him as having a head like a coconut, which is probably my favorite description of a person ever. So that's their interpretation of having a head like a coconut, which I love. People, because of what had happened, even though Stonehouse Jack and his friends had already been arrested, other people in town started to be rounded up by these vigilance committees and threatened with execution. So they were literally rounding up the people who were sex workers, and they were pimps and vagrants, and they were actually putting them into groups to try to inflict some sort of punishment upon them. The vigilance committee members were named, so they were actually chosen, so that they didn't have to wait for the formal court system to indict or to charge or indict. They tried the prisoners on their own. They said that that Titusville was full of bad men and loose women, and we needed to do something about it. So right across the street from where the building is today, they were trying the people sort of like on the second floor, and in the ashes of the part of the building that had burned down, people in Titusville started erecting a gallows to not only intimidate the people who were on trial, but to say, well, once they find them guilty, we'll just be ready and we can just take them right across the street and be done with it. And the Herald watched the construction of this gallows, and they wrote all about it in the paper, because every day they would say, well, this seems a little dark, maybe we shouldn't be going this far. And then the next day they'd say, no, we need to go this far, we're so ready, we have all the lumber. Yeah, so they were kind of waffly on whether they liked this or not. However, to the credit of Titusville people, instead of executing them publicly, the Stonehouse Jack and his fellows were all sentenced to expulsion. So the phrase that you hear, ran out of town on a rail, that's exactly what they did to them. They found out through trying them that the fires had been set by wood shavings and oily rags underneath porches and like in windows and things like that. They just been pushed in there and then set on fire. And that they not only wanted to expel Stonehouse Jack and his friends, but they were also just going to take this opportunity, because they had public sentiment behind them, to just send out anybody who was of bad character, whatever that meant to them. So they sent them away upon penalty of death. They said, if you ever come back to Titusville, we already got the gallows ready, so don't try us, sort of thing. They took them to the train, they put them on, and they said, goodbye, you're going to Buffalo, have a nice life. Stonehouse Jack's reply to that is one of my favorite things, because he said, thanks for the free ticket, I was probably going to go there anyway. So that was kind of humorous to me. Another angle to the story is, so when they were on the train, and of course, as you know, the train went through Corey. So when they got to Corey, they actually ended up meeting up with some of his friends from Buffalo who had heard about what happened and were traveling down to Titusville under the assumption that Stonehouse Jack and his friends had been executed, and they wanted to seek revenge on the people of Titusville. So lucky for Titusville, that didn't happen, because that would have been a lot more fires. And they all ended up going to Buffalo themselves. It was rumored that Stonehouse Jack wrote a couple letters to the Herald after that, sort of taunting people a little bit. It's impossible to say whether that was actually him or that was somebody who was trying to be funny. But the general consensus was that he ended up in Canada, committed some more crimes, and ended up being arrested up there. And his ultimate demise is unknown. The block was rebuilt in 1877, and as you know, it has unfortunately been plagued with some fire since then, somewhat recently, but I think it goes to show what a resilient place that is and what a cornerstone of Titusville from the oil days all the way through today. It's a real thread tying our history together. Okay, and the last story I want to tell you about Titusville is something called Ridgeway Acneliniment. A lot of people have probably heard of the Ridgeway Sanitarium, at least if you're from sort of the Highttown area of the oil region. So Ridgeway Acneliniment wasn't the only oil-based or sort of hokey medicine cure that was hawked during the Victorian era. There's a great story on CBS Sunday Morning this past week about these cures during this time period, because if you think about it, this was, even though there were a lot of people here, there weren't a ton of doctors, and the doctors that were here didn't have access to the kind of technology and the advancements that people had in more urban areas. So it was really easy for people to fall prey to cures that may or may not have helped them and just was sort of a placebo effect type thing. One of those was called pie saws. I know it looks like Pizos, but it's pie saws because they even had a pronunciation on their flyer. Pie saws cure for consumption, which was from the Warren area. And that was, they had a bunch of different names for it, but the consumption one was the most common because it was very common to get infected with consumption during this period, and a lot of people died from it as well. And that pretty much just had like opium in it, and that was about it. It would probably make you high, and that's why you felt better. It wasn't really curing anything. They also had the Oregon Indian Medicine Company, and that was originally founded out in Washington, and it was sort of a traveling medicine show that found a home in Northwestern Pennsylvania because it was very popular. They would not only sell you things, but they would also have a show where they set up a stage and chairs, and you could watch them sort of impersonate Native American culture and then buy these remedies that would supposedly cure you. A less offensive version of that is the Ridgeway Acneliniment. So this was founded by a man named Sam Ridgeway. He was born on April 29th, that's ironic, April 29th, 1824. He was the 8th of 9 children. So if you can imagine having 9 children in 1824, that was a difficult life. He was the uncle of Jonathan Titus, and at this time, the area, like I said in the beginning, it's still wilderness. There's Hightown itself didn't exist. It was just called Oil Creek. There were no people here. There were very, very few people here. It took a long time to get to Titusville. It was sort of like still like an outpost. He ended up marrying Eliza Hyde, hence Hightown, and the couple had 8 children. He was 35 years old when Drake struck oil, so he was already pretty established. He was a grown adult at this time. He wasn't a child or anything. And because of that, he ended up getting a job with the railroad. And that was a pretty lucrative job, but he didn't really enjoy it. And he cared more about helping people. So unlike Pisaw's Cure for Consumption or the Oregon Indian Medicine Company, he wasn't really in it for the money. He more so actually wanted to make a difference in people's lives, and he just thought this was a good way to do it. So instead of pumping oil for commercial profit and sending it out, he was using oil to treat cows. And people said that on their farms, he was rubbing it in like a salve. They weren't ingesting it at first. It was just more like a lotion, and then you would rub it in a specific way. And the people started saying, well, if it works for my cow, do you think it would work for me? Because, that's logical. So he said, I don't know, let's try it. And in 1882, he built his sanitarium, which you can see in the top picture here. And you can also see in the bottom picture on the far left, there's that the ladder, and there's people standing on the balcony. This was a major draw to the Hightown/Oil Creek area. On July 3rd, 1883, he received a federal patent for his Acneliniment. And the most important thing was this special massage technique that he used on people when they came to the sanitarium. So you could buy the Acneliniment in other stores, in like Warren and more towards Pittsburgh, even up into New York. You could buy the liniment. But what you really wanted to do was come to the sanitarium so that you could experience the rest and relaxation of the place and also get treatment right from the guy himself. And people came from all over. They came from Pittsburgh and Boston and Canada. It was a widespread thing. People knew about Samuel. So he ended up putting out a lot of pamphlets about what the salve could do for you. And he claimed that it could cure anything from rheumatism to cancer to neuralgia, all kinds of different things. And lucky for him, he was right on the railway line. So people could just stop, get off, and you would be right there. And a big sign that he put, I don't think you can see it in the picture, but his tagline for the sanitarium was "the last resort for suffering humanity." And that was actually, it really was, because he was right on the line. They would stop, they'd come off. It was the last resort. There was nowhere else to go, because if you know anything about the railway lines in Titusville at the time, they were owned by 2 different companies. So the rail line came in, the next rail line started. You can't see my hands, but it started like this. And you had to get off the trolley car, the train, and get on the next one. You couldn't just keep on the same line the whole time, which caused problems for some people who got hurt by those vehicles, but that's a different story. So his family was very large, and unfortunately, he ended up dealing with a lot of family trauma. So in 1890, his daughter, she was 36, and she ended up dying. And then only a week later, his 39-year-old daughter, Demma, also died in what seems to be unrelated causes. So that was 2 really quick blows to the family. And the 2 daughters were very large presences in the family. They lived right near the rest of them. They were active in the business, so that was very difficult for them. In addition, 2 of Demma's children had also died very soon before that. So in total, in a very short span of time, the Ridgeway family lost 4 people. So not only were they running this business, but they were dealing with a lot of personal issues. However, they persevered, and they advertised all over the region. They were selling in drugstores, and at the height of it, the sanitarium could house 150 patients. And that might not sound like a ton, but in comparison, Highttown at the time, the population was only 300. So half of Highttown's population was living in this one building. So it's pretty spectacular that he had that kind of draw. Unfortunately, their sorrow did not end after the death of their daughters, because on May 3rd, 1892, there was a lightning strike, and it ended up igniting the oil liniment in the laboratory in the basement type area, and it created an absolute inferno because all of the liniment was oil based. So everything just went up. And unfortunately, because they were in this sort of outpost area, all they could do was a bucket brigade. And if you look at the size of that building, a bucket brigade was not going to do it. When it did end up catching on fire, there were 7 people inside, and they had a 17-year-old worker who had been living with them. Her name was Ostie Bidwell, and she was killed in the fire. And it was found out that she was killed pretty much instantly. She was in the laboratory area when the lightning struck. So it looked like when it blew up, she was done from the beginning. As I said, she had lived with the Ridgeways. Her mother had died years prior, and she had come to live with them as a family friend. However, when she died, her father, who hadn't really spoken to her for some time, thought it would be a great opportunity to sue the Ridgeway family because he saw a deep pocket. So he sued them, and he tried to get $3,000 as a settlement for her death. And it dragged out for many months. Ridgeway was taken to court, and when they finally got to court, the judge told Bidwell's father, "You're being disgusting with this behavior. Ridgeway paid for your daughter's funeral in full, really fancy funeral. He paid to bury her. They fed her and housed her. This was a complete accident, and you're going to get nothing." So he didn't end up getting in trouble for that, other than the trouble that was the multi-month lawsuit. In 1901, Samuel Ridgeway died. He died of diabetes. And an interesting development after his death was that his daughter, Eliza Nason, ended up taking over the business. And this is unusual just because it is 1901 and he had multiple sons. And yet his daughter was the one that took over the business. She saw through the rebuilding after the fire. And unfortunately for Eliza, she had the same penchant for luck that her father did, because in 1903, the sanitarium burned down again. And they never really figured out why the sanitarium burned down the second time, because there was no electricity and there were no active gas lines in the building. And what they were thinking was, unfortunately, because of those train tracks that were right beside the building, they believed that a spark was thrown from the tracks onto the roof, and then it lit the building on fire. So the train was a blessing and a curse in this instance. However, she also persevered, and she rebuilt the sanitarium, and she operated it for an additional 7 years. It ended up closing in 1910, and version 2, her rebuilt version, today is the Rustic Inn, which you can drive by and see. That's what it was originally. It was her second version of the sanitarium. So that's my book. Those are just some 3 oil region based stories from my book. Won't give it all away, but I just think what I like to highlight for oil region history is those social angles. You know, with Samuel, what did his family go through? And what was it like to own a business in this area? And how did oil impact you in a way that maybe isn't as direct as you might think originally? And those sort of like more hidden stories, I guess, that I am trying to unhide. And I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. If I can make this big.
All right. We don't have any questions right now in the chat. Does anybody have a question? Please feel free to type it away. Oh, we do have one. Let's see. Lindy would like to know, where was the original sanitarium?
So it was sort of in the same area there that the rustic is now. If you drive past there, if you just imagine it much longer, it's pretty much the same area. And another interesting thing that I like to do, that if you like drive up the street and if you have like a printout of one of those postcards and you look, you can identify exactly where it would be. So.
All right, we have another question from Jason. He wants to know, was there an underlying reason that Jack was lighting fires, or was it just to cause bedlam?
It seems that it was just to cause bedlam, which is a great word. I mean, he definitely was kind of a pyromaniac. He liked fire a lot, so maybe that's like an angle to it. But when in his time in Pithole and Petroleum Center, from what I read, he would also cause trouble in those areas, and it was pretty much just whatever he could get into. I thought it was interesting when I was reading about him. I thought he was much older than he actually was. He was only around like 21 or 22, so it kind of was like he was just kind of a bad kid with a lot of bad time on his hands. So yeah, I think he just wanted to cause trouble.
All right, we got a couple of more here. Another one about Stonehouse Jack. Sue wants to know where did you learn that Stonehouse Jack went to Canada?
That was a report from the paper, so that could be, true, or it's what he told them, and it's what they said they knew, that he went to Canada. I haven't actually traced him to Canada, so that might be like an angle for future research too, like seeing. The hard thing with him is, what name did he go under? Because he had so many different aliases. I think that would be tough with him. I tried to find his family and stuff. That was definitely a challenge. But from what I hear, he never came back. So I would say he was either in Buffalo or Canada, but he said he was in Canada, so that's the only thing I know about that.
Okay. Ed wants to know, what would have been the average speed of the train?
Oh, that's a great question. I do not know.
I do not know either, Ed. I'm wondering, Sue Bates is on this presentation, watching in our audience. I'm wondering if she might know the answer.
I wouldn't think that fast. At least that's
yeah.
I mean, it's not a bullet train, it's
right.
enough to kill people. I don't know. That's not a speed enough to kill people. But yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question.
Yeah, we'll look into that for you, Ed. We'll get you an answer. Diane wants to know if the town of Ridgeway is named for Samuel Ridgeway.
I don't know anything about the town of Ridgeway personally. There were a lot of Ridgeways, so it's possible there's some sort of familial connection there. Quite a few of them did noteworthy things, but I'm not sure if one of them was the namesake.
Right. Sue Bates did come through. She says she's heard 25 miles per hour, Ed. And
so I guess
also,
between the two of them would be a good speed.
Yeah. She also wants to know, on the previous question about Canada, does the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, maybe they might have some information.
Oh, they might, yeah.
Yeah. Juliet would like to know where your book can be purchased. I'm sure you have a number of places it can be purchased. It can also be purchased at the Drakewell Museum store when we reopen.
Yes.
But where else can it get picked up? What can they pick it up?
It's also on the publisher's website, so Arcadia Publishing, if you just put in the title of my book. I think it's also on Amazon, but if you're going to buy it, I would prefer that you buy it either from lovely Drakewell or the publisher, to just support the smaller businesses.
Thank you. Another question from Juliet. What is your favorite strange oil region death?
Oh, there's so many good ones. That's tough. There's a lot of really good deaths. Okay, I'm gonna plug something else here, because Juliet is my sister, and we wrote an article for the Oilfield Journal, and we talk about all kinds of different ways there were to die in the oil region. So there's a variety of different deaths, depending on the category. I mean, there's some great oil-based deaths that she talks about in the article, but some of my, and that sounds terrible to say favorite death, but you know what I mean. We're history people. You're going to have favorite deaths. Some of mine are oh, this is terrible now because of what we're doing, but contagious disease deaths. There were a lot of different things that hit Titusville. I'm particularly interested in consumption and how consumption was spread in Titusville. That hasn't been talked about a lot. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, look for the Oilfield Journal when it comes out next, because we're going to have stuff in there. So
that's true. We do not have a publication date yet.
Okay.
As you can imagine, things
Just
have
wait.
been delayed a bit, but that will be in the upcoming edition of Drake Wells' Oilfield Journal. So
just keep you excited.
I know it's currently in editing.
Oh, good.
So let's see. Jason has another question. Was the judicial system ineffective, and was this typical of the time period or Titusville in general?
That is a great question that I've actually never been asked before, but I'd love to answer it, because the answer is yes. The judicial system was extremely ineffective. It took forever. Attorneys were particularly ineffective in this area at the time. People were very bad at investigating major crimes. So anything from like a train wreck to murder, they just really weren't good at it. They would, there's something else I write about in my book where the investigators were pretty sure that there was a double murder that occurred in the quarry area, and they arrested multiple people, all from the same family for the most part, and the trial ended up dragging out for, oh goodness, months and months and months. And that still happens today to a degree. A speedy trial is never really that speedy. But they would just railroad people, no pun intended, they would railroad people over and over again because they just didn't know what else to do. And judges were also pretty ineffective at the time. I think my favorite part that I've ever read out of any of these cases was a judge who, both attorneys were ready to present their cases. The defendant was ready, and the judge said, I need 4 more months because I need to read the law again because I don't know what it is. That was probably my favorite one. It's your only job to know the law, and he didn't do it. So yes, great question.
All right, we have one more here from Diane. Ointments even now are oil-based. Is any of the Ridgeway liniment still manufactured or in use?
It's definitely not manufactured. I hope it's not in use because it would be really, really old. But the seed of the idea, I think, yeah, definitely. Using any kind of petroleum-based product as a salve or as a rub. I mean, we still do that. It's just in different forms. I don't know if anybody's necessarily saying, come to my house and let me massage you with my petroleum, because that would be weird. But the basis of it, yeah, I think it's definitely still around.
Sue Bates said, has a question about Ridgeway. Did the Ridgeway records burn in the last fire?
From what I know, sort of. There are still some things in existence. I got some photocopies of some stuff, some booklets and things, because tangentially I'm related to those Ridgeways, which was something I found out along the way. And I got some stuff from the person that I'm related to, and I've heard that they have some more originals in the family somewhere. I'm not really sure where, and I don't know how much of it survived. So I guess my answer is sort of.
Very good. Ed wants to know if your book covers the death of Rouse. I'm assuming he means Henry Rouse.
It does not, but that's a great story. I was doing things that people might not know so much about, and which is really hard to do, just because you have to try to guess what people know about. And I run into people all the time that don't know about things that I thought they would. But the Henry Rouse story is very interesting. Yeah.
And a question I think that is for me, is the ointment something that you can make and sell in the museum store? I like the entrepreneurial spirit, Jason, but I feel that we at Drakewell do not condone or tell folks that they should use petroleum as what to help what ails them. Though Sue Bates says she wants Drakewell to have the recipe. So
it'd be funny.
If you come across the recipe, let us know.
I will let you know.
And Jason wants to know, wants everybody to know that that our friends at Old Economy Village have that Tidiute connection and would be happy to partner.
I love it. People still have their, I've seen the Ridgeway Acneliniment bottles still in existence. Yeah. So you could make like a replica of the bottle even.
Very nice. All right. I think that, let's see. Juliet has a bottle with a partial label. I tell you, we're going to make things happen here.
Yeah, because we restored their family cemetery. I guess that's sort of
okay.
A plug too. Yeah, so if you ever want to visit the family cemetery, it's also in Hightown. And my sister and I restored their gravestones, so you can see all of that.
Fantastic. Sue Bates has a question for Jason. Did the Economites use the Ridgeway cure? So we'll let them talk that one out. But thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, everybody. Let's give Jessica, I'll give her an audible
thanks.
Clap, a round of applause. Thank you so much for not only being a good sport and being our guinea pig, but bringing us really great stories. This was really, really fantastic. Thank you all for coming. If you are interested, we are doing a second live lecture next week on the 6th. We will be making a Facebook announcement in the next few days, and it'll be the same procedure where you simply send me an email and you will get on our RSVP list, and about an hour before the presentation, I will send out a link. Next week, we will have Jen Burden of the Oil Region Alliance, and she is going to be giving us a presentation on the Oil Region's prodigal son, Coal Oil Johnny. So we're very excited for that. So if you're interested, please do get in contact, tell your friends. We can host a lot of folks. So thank you very much for spending part of your evening with us, and stay healthy. And we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.